The annexation of Canada began in 2059. The resource wars was escalating. The European Commonwealth deployed their militaries in the Middle East to claim more resources, and the United States, knowing the same could eventually happen to them, started protecting their natural resources, mostly from the People's Republic of China, who were getting a bit too bold for Uncle Sam's liking. The Anchorage front line was established near the Alaskan town, guarding the crude oil fields and the Trans-Alaska pipeline that directed the oil to the rest of the nation. Since a stretch of that pipeline crossed through Canadian territory, Canada allowed American military units to station along its length and provide security. Naturally, this led to mounting tension, as Canadian citizens became increasingly displeased with the presence of foreign soldiers on their soil. But it was going to get a lot worse. 7 years later, in 2066, China was finally desperate enough to make a move, and just as the US anticipated, they invaded Anchorage and took control of the pipeline. You can learn more about that in my previous video, but this declaration was the official beginning of the Sino-American War. The US military presence in Canada continued to grow as more soldiers, equipment, and materials were transported through the country. As a result, mass riots broke out in several Canadian cities. The people, as far as they were concerned, were not at war with China, and they didn't want China to come after their resources either, like they were doing with America. But their worries should have been a little closer to home. Faced with a deteriorating situation between China's invasion and civilian resistance along the pipeline, the United States military changed tactics, moving beyond simply guarding the pipeline and shipping resources through their neighbours' land. They began exploiting Canada's resources for the war efforts. Vast stretches of timberland were destroyed beyond recovery, while other natural resources were pushed to their limits. By 2069, Canada began to feel the full pressure of the United States military presence, as the US drew ever more heavily on Canadian resources. Among Americans, Canada started to become known as Little America, a distant territory framed through propaganda, while Canadian protests continued to fall on deaf ears. 3 years later, in 2072, citizens of Canada had finally had enough of the US exploitation of their resources. Protests were not enough, their politicians were not listening, leaving them with no other choice but to take matters into their own hands. And then, the pipeline was sabotaged. Officially, the attackers were unknown. They might have been Chinese agents, Canadian partisans, a mixture of both, or something else entirely. But there's also a chance it was the US, deliberately giving themselves just cause for what came next: annexation. In a statement to the press, Buzz Babcock, hilarious name by the way, commander of the US forces in Canada, cited security concerns as the primary reason for annexation. He said the sabotage of the pipeline was the last straw. Effective immediately, United States troops would be taking full control of all Canadian assets and resources. Little America was theirs, and in his view, always had been. Annexation was enforced through military occupation and propaganda. Countless Canadians were arrested, disappeared, or were held in detention centres. One of the most infamous examples was the Uranium City internment camp, operated by the United States Armed Forces. Located in Uranium City, a settlement in northern Saskatchewan, originally built to house the workers from the local uranium mines, so it's likely that prisoners were then put in those homes and then sent to work in the mines to support the war effort. Just a theory, but I feel like that's something that could happen. Military personnel, including US Marines, were tasked with controlling the camp's population. Anyone suspected of working against American interests, so spies, communist sympathizers, political rivals, or alleged resistance supporters, could be sent here or to similar camps across occupied Canada. At one point, the Uranium City internment camp experienced at least one mass escape, apparently triggered by an attack from Canadian freedom fighters. Steph Harper and her mother joined the chaos, fleeing alongside other detainees, only to be discovered by a vertibird. A Marine in power armor confronted them, ordering them to return to the camp and threatening to shoot them if they refused. Before either side could escalate the confrontation, a Canadian prisoner charged the guard with explosives, killing them both. Steph's mother was fatally wounded in the blast, but with her dying breath, she urged Steph to head south, cross into the United States, and climb as high as she could within American society to survive the incoming flood. She also told Steph to abandon her Catholic upbringing, to kill whoever she needed to survive, and to stop seeing the people of the United States as human beings, only as Americans, a sentiment I'm sure many Canadians shared after being annexed. By January 2076, a mere 4 years after the pipeline was sabotaged, the United States had effectively completed the annexation of Canada. When images of atrocities crossed the border, they sparked unrest and protest among the American public, many of whom were only now becoming aware of the scale of the occupation and the brutal reality the Canadian people were enduring. Despite lingering efforts by Canadian resistance groups, these actions had little impact on the course of events. Resistance movements were fragmented, poorly equipped, and overwhelmed by an enemy that possessed power armor, air support, and near-total control of infrastructure. American forces swept through the territory largely unimpeded, seizing the resources needed to sustain the war efforts against China. Canada, as a sovereign nation, was finished. A year later, in 2077, the annexation was formally recognized and Canada ceased to exist. Its former provinces were reorganized as US territory, remaining under American political and military control, effectively becoming the US's 51st state, though one without statehood or autonomous control. Canadian citizens were issued temporary status identification cards, listing them as residents of the newly annexed territory. Even though they were annexed and technically Americans, they were still identified as Canadians. Violence continued to escalate. Security detachments equipped with power armor were deployed to suppress the population. Protesters, rioters, and suspected partisans were no longer taken to internment camps, which were likely already full. Instead, many were shot on sight, sometimes even executed on camera for the nation to see. Open warfare broke out across the former nation, with the Yukon becoming one of several active fronts alongside Anchorage. Despite public outcry, the military initiative pressed on. Propaganda portrayed the annexation as a liberation, with comic strips and cartoons celebrating US occupation forces while vilifying Canadian resistance. Meanwhile, third parties moved quickly to profit from the occupation, and Vault-Tec began advertising available vault spaces in newly annexed Canada. Even with the American military, the annexation provoked mixed reactions. Some soldiers, such as Randall Clark, later described the occupation as criminal. However, not all Americans saw the situation for what it truly was. A soldier, assigned as the manager of the combined wastewater treatment plant and underground ICBM launch complex in Ashton, described severe safety failures, constant equipment issues, and growing environmental instability beneath the facility. These concerns culminated in him telling his commander that once his term was up, he was moving to Canada, seeking a place untouched by the chaos consuming the rest of the country. Requests for additional funding and improved safety protocols were repeatedly ignored. Rather than addressing the concerns, Commander Devlin dismissed them outright, calling the manager a commie-eyed puke for showing interest in living in Canada, and accusing him of undermining the war efforts, the kind of things that can get you thrown in prison, or worse. Even though Canada had already been annexed and militarized at that point, it still existed in the imagination of some Americans as a place to escape. For others, even the mere idea of living in Canada was cause for concern. In the end, however, their opinions didn't matter in the slightest. When the Great War erupted and borders collapsed, Canada was erased for a second time. Some Canadians, like Dane, travelled all the way from Okanagan Valley in search of something better, although he later joined the Children of the Cathedral. Others, like Dave Handy, crossed the border in search of love, heading for San Francisco to find Vicki Goldman after seeing one of her adult movies. And then there's Marge LaBarge, who was born after the Great War near Lake La Berge. She migrated in search of opportunity, following the flow of trade goods, moving north from regions like New California. We know almost nothing about the locations these people come from, but there is somewhere we might know of, and that could potentially be Toronto. In the pit, the ruins of Pittsburgh, Lord Asher gives a speech to his involuntary workers, where he mentions,
"Where others merely survive, we thrive. Our industry is the envy of the commonwealth. Our safety is the envy of the capital wastes. Our might is the envy of Ronto."
Additionally, a slave named Brand asks the Lone Wanderer if they come from Ronto, implying the raiders of the pit venture to Ronto to capture slaves, marking it as a weak, lawless city, much like Washington, D.C., which they also raid. However, there is no definitive proof that Ronto is Toronto, but given that Pittsburgh became the pit, it is a possibility. In the end, the Great War did nothing to improve Canada's condition. The annexation took away their resources, their freedom and sovereignty. People were rounded up, sent to camps, and killed when they tried to leave. A truly horrific time to be alive. And now, after the Great War, things are only worse, with food, water, and safety being scarcer than ever. And if Ronto is Toronto, then Canada's resources are once again on the line. Only this time, instead of timber and ore, it's people, taken by the strong to fuel their own selfish plans. And that suffering might continue through Vault-Tec. Vault-Tec established vaults in Canada, or at least they intended to. Maybe these vaults weren't built in time, maybe they were. For the survivors' sake, I hope they weren't. While some shelters may have been control vaults, they were few and far between. And those who sought refuge inside, believing their lives were about to improve, were only subjected to experiments, disguised as protection, a different kind of internment.